Everyone tells you Napoleon lost because he invaded Russia in winter. That is the story they teach in schools. It protects you from the uglier truth. Napoleon did not fall because of snow. He fell because he ran out of countries to rob. For 12 years, the French emperor ran the largest theft operation in modern history. He did not finance his wars through taxes. He did not borrow from banks. He made his enemies pay for their own destruction. Every conquered city wrote a check. Every defeated king emptied his treasury. Every occupied territory bled gold into French military coffers. This was not corruption. This was policy. The French called it guerre qui nourrit la guerre, war that feeds war, a self-sustaining engine of conquest where victory today paid for the army tomorrow. The numbers exposed the machine. Prussia handed over 140 million francs after its humiliation at Tilsit in 1807. Austria contributed 350 million francs across multiple defeats. The German states, the Italian kingdoms, the Dutch Republic, the Spanish treasury, all of them bled into the same account. Conservative estimates place total French war extractions above 1 billion francs across the Napoleonic period. Adjusted for economic scale, this represents the largest organized wealth transfer in European history before the 20th century. And here is the detail that separates Napoleon from every warlord before him. He kept records. His Intendant General Pierre Deroux ran a bureaucracy of extraction with accounting standards that would impress a modern auditor. This was industrialized plunder. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. Napoleon's financial architecture did not disappear when he sailed to St. Helena. The templates survived. The idea that military dominance could generate self-funding conquest loops shaped how great powers thought about war economics for the next 2 centuries. When you hear modern strategists debate whether sanctions work, whether occupied territories can fund occupation costs, whether economic warfare defeats enemies or strengthens them through forced self-reliance, you are hearing arguments that Napoleon settled with bayonets and ledger books 200 years ago. The emperor who conquered Europe was also the emperor who proved a terrible truth about power. Theft scales faster than production, until it stops. To understand why Napoleon built a theft engine, you must understand what he inherited. France in 1799 was a burned financial ruin. The revolution had annihilated the old fiscal order. The monarchy's debts were repudiated. The assignat currency had collapsed into worthlessness after the revolutionary government printed paper money backed by seized church lands until inflation destroyed all confidence. By 1796, the assignat traded at less than 1% of its face value. The entire concept of French public credit had been murdered. This created a structural problem that shaped everything Napoleon did afterward. Britain could borrow, France could not. The British government had spent a century building credibility with bondholders. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, provided institutional machinery for sovereign debt issuance. British investors trusted British bonds. When war came, London opened its checkbook. The British national debt rose from £228 million in 1793 to £834 million by 1815. That represented 250% of national income. The British fought Napoleon on credit. France had no such option. Revolutionary bankruptcy meant French bonds were junk. No rational investor would lend to a government that had just defaulted on everything. The market remembered. Capital has a long memory. So Napoleon faced an arithmetic impossibility. He wanted to conquer Europe. Conquest requires armies. Armies require money. Money requires either taxes, debt, or theft. Taxes had limits. The French population was poorer than the British population. Per capita, GDP in England was twice that of France in 1800. You cannot extract what does not exist. Napoleon improved French tax collection through better bureaucracy, but the base remained smaller than Britain's industrial wealth. Debt was closed. Nobody would lend. That left theft. The genius of Napoleon was recognizing this constraint and building an entire military economic system around it. He did not stumble into plunder. He engineered it. The Banque de France tells this story. Napoleon founded it on January 18, 1800, within weeks of seizing power. Official histories describe it as a stabilization measure for post-revolutionary monetary chaos. This is technically true, but the deeper function was creating a monetary architecture that Napoleon personally controlled. In 1805, Napoleon reorganized the Banque de France to give himself direct leverage over its operations. The bank operated on a bimetallic standard. Gold and silver backed the currency. This discipline prevented the inflationary spiral that had destroyed the assignat. But it also meant France could not print its way to military funding. Every franc spent on war had to come from somewhere real. That somewhere was the rest of Europe. Napoleon perfected 3 interlocking extraction systems. Each fed into the others. Together, they formed the most efficient conquest funding apparatus since the Roman tributum. The first system was direct indemnity. When Napoleon defeated an enemy, the peace treaty included a bill. This was not negotiable. Pay or face continued occupation. Pay or watch your capital burn. Prussia learned this at Tilsit. After Napoleon destroyed the Prussian army at Jena Auerstedt in 1806, he dictated terms that went beyond territorial amputation. Prussia owed 140 million francs in war contributions. The sum was calculated to extract maximum value without triggering complete state collapse. Napoleon needed Prussia, weakened but functional enough to keep paying. Austria faced similar treatment. Across multiple wars and treaties, Austrian contributions reached 350 million francs. Each defeat added new line items. Each piece bought time until the next extraction. The second system was ongoing occupation taxation. French armies in occupied territories did not merely pass through. They established administrative structures that redirected local tax revenues to French military accounts. Spain, the German states, the Italian peninsula, all became tributaries feeding the war machine. Intendant General Pierre Daru managed this system with bureaucratic precision. His office tracked revenues from occupied departments. They calculated sustainable extraction rates. They balanced short-term plunder against long-term productive capacity. This was not mindless looting. It was systematic resource harvesting. The third system was outright seizure, treasury reserves, art collections, strategic stockpiles. French armies took physical possession of movable wealth. The famous Louvre collection contains pieces that arrived in Paris on military wagons. But beyond cultural artifacts, Napoleon's forces seized gold reserves, commercial inventories, and state property across conquered territories. The combination produced financial results that seem impossible until you trace the flows. France entered the Napoleonic period with public debt at roughly 10% of GDP. This was artificially low because of revolutionary bankruptcy. But the number stayed low throughout the wars. By 1820, French government debt stood at 43% of GDP. Compare this to Britain. British debt peaked at 250% of national income by 1816. France fought the same war, lost that war, and emerged with 1/6 the debt burden of its victorious enemy. The reason is simple. Britain borrowed to fight, France stole to fight. Borrowing creates obligations, theft does not. François Veldé's analysis of French public debt records confirms the structure. He writes that Napoleon did not borrow from the public. War expenses were paid through fiscal improvements and compensations extracted from defeated parties. This is the scholarly way of saying that Napoleon ran a theft-financed empire. The 1810 French military budget reached 503 million francs. That same year, France extracted hundreds of millions from occupied territories and vassal states. The numbers roughly balanced. Conquest paid for itself, as long as conquest continued. Theft through military victory was Napoleon's primary funding mechanism. But he deployed a second weapon aimed at destroying British economic power without direct invasion. The Continental system represented history's first modern economic warfare campaign. The Berlin Decree of November 1806 announced the strategy. All European ports under French control would close to British goods. No British ships could dock. No British manufacturers could enter. Napoleon meant to strangle British commerce by cutting off its largest export market. The theory was elegant. Britain was an island dependent on trade. British factories produced goods for European consumers. Close the European market and British factories go silent. Silent factories mean unemployed workers. Unemployed workers mean political instability. Political instability forces Britain to negotiate. Napoleon was applying economic logic. He understood that Britain's industrial revolution had created a wealth-generating machine that France could not match through domestic production alone. British per capita output was double that of France. British textile mills and iron foundries operated at scales French artisans could not approach. A straight production competition meant French defeat. So Napoleon tried to change the rules. If France could not outproduce Britain, France would outlaw British production from reaching customers. The early results encouraged optimism. British exports to Northern Europe fell between 25% and 50% during peak blockade effectiveness in 1808 and 1812. British merchants howled. British manufacturers saw orders cancelled. The British economy entered recession. But the Continental system contained fatal contradictions. First, it required universal compliance. Every port had to close. Every border had to seal. This demanded military enforcement across thousands of miles of coastline and frontier. Napoleon did not have enough soldiers to patrol every fishing village and mountain pass. Second, it created massive incentives for smuggling. The price differential between legal Continental goods and banned British goods made smuggling enormously profitable. By 1811, over 800 vessels operated as smugglers in European waters. They moved approximately 10 million pounds sterling in British goods annually into southern Europe and the Mediterranean. The blockade leaked like a sieve. Third, it hurt Napoleon's allies more than it hurt Britain. European consumers wanted British textiles. European industries needed British machinery and inputs. Closing ports to British goods raised prices, created shortages, and generated resentment across occupied territories. The people Napoleon needed to keep pacified grew angry at policies that made their lives harder. Fourth, and most destructive to Napoleon's own strategy, the Continental system created enforcement requirements that expanded French military commitments beyond sustainable limits. Portugal refused to close its ports to Britain. Napoleon had to invade. Spain proved unreliable as an enforcer. Napoleon had to intervene, which triggered a guerrilla war that consumed 300,000 French troops for 6 years. Russia eventually broke from the Continental system because Russian nobles needed to sell grain and timber to British markets. Napoleon had to invade. The economic warfare weapon turned into a military overextension trap. Eli, Heckscher's foundational study of the Continental system, documents this failure arc. He shows that British trade adapted. New markets opened in Latin America after Spanish colonial control collapsed. British merchants found routes around the blockade. British industry proved more resilient than Napoleon anticipated. Meanwhile, the Continental system produced an unintended consequence that economic historian Recayou-Hache has quantified. French departments cut off from British manufactured goods had to develop domestic industries. Forced import substitution accelerated French industrial development in some regions. The blockade meant to weaken Britain accidentally strengthened pockets of French production. But this was inadequate compensation. Napoleon's war machine needed immediate revenue flows, not long-term industrial development. The Continental system consumed military resources without generating the extraction revenues that funded the army. It was a strategic tax on French power rather than a source of income. Every extraction system reaches exhaustion. Napoleon hit his limit between 1811 and 1812. The arithmetic turned negative. Spain consumed troops and money without generating net returns. The guerrilla war meant occupation costs exceeded extraction revenues. Portugal remained unconquered. Britain poured weapons and gold to Iberian resistance through Lisbon and Cadiz. The extraction base shrank. After a decade of systematic plunder, conquered territories had less to give. Prussia, Austria, the German states, they had been squeezed repeatedly. Treasuries were empty. Tax bases were depleted. The flow of indemnities and contributions slowed. Meanwhile, military costs kept rising. Armies require constant resupply. Soldiers require pay. The Grande Armée of 1812 numbered over 600,000 men. Feeding, equipping, and paying this force demanded enormous sums. The debt records exposed the crisis. French government debt had stayed remarkably stable throughout the conquest years. But between 1811 and 1814, it rose fivefold. Napoleon had to start borrowing. The theft engine could no longer cover expenses. This is the structural fact that conventional histories miss when they focus on Russian winter. Napoleon invaded Russia because he needed to invade Russia. The Continental system was failing. Russian defection meant British goods flowed freely into Eastern European markets. Russian grain fed British workers. Napoleon could not tolerate this. But Russia was different from previous targets. The Russian treasury was not concentrated in a capital that could be seized. Russian wealth was distributed across a vast territory that retreated rather than surrendered. The extraction model depended on quick victories followed by occupation and systematic resource harvesting. Russia offered no quick victory. The 1812 campaign destroyed the Grande Armée. Over 400,000 men did not return. This was a military catastrophe, but the financial catastrophe mattered more for Napoleon's system. Dead soldiers had to be replaced. Replacement required money. Money required either new conquests or new debt. New conquests were no longer possible against an emboldened coalition, so Napoleon borrowed. And he discovered what the revolution had learned before him. French credit was terrible. Lenders charged high interest rates. The terms were punishing. Each loan dug the hole deeper. The coalition that defeated Napoleon in 1814 and again in 1815 included nations that had spent a decade as extraction targets. They fought with the fury of the robbed. The bill came due. French debt after Waterloo reflected the collapse of the theft model. Occupation costs, reparations to the victors, and accumulated wartime borrowing pushed debt levels up. But even then, French debt remained far below British levels as a percentage of national income. The theft model had worked for 12 years. It collapsed in 3. Napoleon proved something that powerful people have never forgotten. Conquest can pay for itself, until it cannot. The numbers tell the aftermath story. Britain spent a generation managing debt accumulated to defeat Napoleon. British taxpayers paid interest on Napoleonic war bonds into the 20th century. The final bonds from this era were not retired until 2015, 200 years of payments. The conquered nations paid differently. Prussian state capacity was crippled for years after Tilsit. Austrian finances were destabilized through repeated indemnities. The Italian states, the German principalities, the Dutch, all emerged from the Napoleonic period with depleted treasuries and damaged economies. The wealth Napoleon extracted did not return. France itself emerged in a paradoxical position. Lower debt than Britain despite losing the war. This was the dividend of robbery. But French industrial development lagged British development. The structural gap that existed in 1800 widened by 1815. Britain had borrowed to build. France had stolen to fight. Building created capacity. Fighting destroyed it. The extraction model left France victorious in ledger books and defeated in factories. Modern strategists study this outcome. The Napoleonic lesson appears in analysis of every subsequent occupation-based military economy. The Germans learned it in 2 world wars. Occupied territories can fund war efforts temporarily, but extraction depletes the base. Resistance rises, costs multiply, the mathematics eventually reverse. Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine triggered explicit comparisons to Napoleonic economics. Analysts asked whether occupied Ukrainian industrial regions could fund Russian war costs. They asked whether economic isolation through Western sanctions would weaken Russia or force import substitution that strengthened domestic industry. They were asking Napoleonic questions. The Continental system casts a long shadow over modern sanctions debates. When Western governments froze Russian central bank assets and cut Russia from SWIFT networks, historians immediately invoked Napoleon's economic warfare against Britain. The questions were identical. Could economic isolation force political capitulation? Or would the targeted economy adapt, find alternative markets, develop domestic substitutes? Napoleon's answer was that economic warfare works slowly while military costs accumulate quickly. The Continental system damaged Britain but did not defeat Britain. Meanwhile, enforcing the blockade extended French military commitments into Spain and Russia. The economic weapon required military guarantees. The military guarantees proved more expensive than the economic damage they inflicted. Modern sanctions strategists study this precedent. They debate whether sustained economic pressure over years can achieve what Napoleon's more aggressive blockade failed to achieve over months. They debate whether interconnected global finance makes sanctions more effective today, or whether cryptocurrency, Chinese trade relationships, and shadow financial networks function as the modern equivalent of those 800 smuggling ships that defeated Napoleon's blockade. The Banque de France still exists. It operates as part of the European Central Bank system. Its Napoleonic founding purpose, providing monetary architecture that a head of state could control and direct toward military ends, shaped central banking debates for 2 centuries. The questions of central bank independence, of monetary policy, serving political versus economic stability goals, of currency arrangements as tools of national power, all have roots in what Napoleon built and what his enemies observed him building. The war contribution model also persists in modified forms. When victors impose reparations on defeated nations, they are applying Napoleonic logic. The Treaty of Versailles extracted wealth from Germany using intellectual frameworks Napoleon established. The debates about whether reparations stabilize or destabilize defeated nations draw on evidence from the Napoleonic experience. Your government operates within financial architectures that Napoleon's wars helped define. Your currency exists within central banking frameworks that Napoleon pioneered. Your understanding of how wars are funded and what wars cost reflects categories established when French armies marched across Europe demanding payment. Napoleon proved that war could be made to pay. He proved that conquest could fund conquest. He proved that a nation with no credit could build the most powerful military in Europe through systematic extraction. He also proved the limit. When the conquests stop, the bills come due. When victims organize, the theft engine breaks. When military momentum reverses, the debt arrives all at once. The warlord who funded everything through robbery ended his days on a rock in the South Atlantic. The empire of extraction became a cautionary tale studied by every subsequent power that imagined it could make enemies pay for their own defeat. The money flows. Napoleon engineered, still echo. The lesson Napoleon taught still applies. Theft scales faster than production, until it stops.